Hello, folks, and welcome to a hopefully relatively short video that serves to offer up our basic introduction to some important fundamental concepts that we'll be thinking about throughout our class. You may be wondering, first of all, why this video is on an assignment for drafting a teaching philosophy statement. And you might also be wondering, holy cow, what's wrong with him? Why is he having us write a teaching philosophy statement in week one of this class where we're going to learn about teaching creative writing? So that might be the question that you have. So allow me to offer up some thoughts on this. So first of all, I think just in general, in many classes, having some kind of diagnostic tool for yourself, so a self-diagnostic tool, um, that you can use to measure what you feel like you've learned and how you've developed over a course of time, is even if it's a short period of time like our 8-week course, can be really useful. And so in many ways, especially this first draft, you're going to see when you turn those in, I am actually, and this is something I do very rarely, I'm not even going to comment on them. I will read them because I think it's useful to get a sense of what people are saying and where people's thoughts are, but I'm not going to give you feedback on them. You'll get credit for them, but that's because I want this really to end up being a marker for yourself for where you start in your thinking about these things and where you end in your thinking about these things. So to kind of make it as low stakes as possible, while I still kind of collectively and holistically get a sense of what people think about this subject of teaching. I've actually thought about cutting out and leaving out some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video, and saving them for later, but I think I've decided to go ahead and do them in here as well. So that's one of the philosophical reasons for a teaching philosophy at the beginning. But then another reason is long-term, that assuming most, if not all of you, are hoping to at some point get to teach, particularly creative writing, ergo your place in this class, this is a document that almost any teaching job is going to ask you to submit. We'll talk maybe later in the course when we get to the end and you're revising this statement at the end of the class what that might look like. But they're generally 1 to 3 pages, single space. It's like one of the few things that we single space in this industry that's prose. But I have certainly applied for jobs in the past that don't require them, but many jobs do at some point along the line. So it's just a good tangible thing for you to have by the time the course is over that you've thought about a couple of times, because it will serve you well when you go to do that. But then also just again, back to kind of a philosophical sensibility, I think that having a teaching philosophy statement is even a rough draft of one where you're not sure what you should say in it, is a really useful item for self-guidance and to help you feel grounded as you are developing both yourself as a teacher, but also as you are putting together courses and assignments and the sort of larger arc of what you're doing. And while you're thinking about the weeds of a day-to-day, week-to-week sense of a course, why am I doing X, Y, or Z in my class? These are things that I think about all the time. And so it can just be a really good tool to serve kind of as a guiding rod for your own thinking. Okay. So what I also want to talk about in this video, and this will just to throw you the bone of having a few things that you can think about as you're writing this teaching philosophy statement, is a few things that I think are generally mostly universal as it relates to teaching creative writing. I use the words nearly universal here because I want to be careful and not suggest that there's anything that is actually the 100% always true in every situation. Because although there are some things that I think come very close to being universally true, as it relates to teaching creative writing, that I would hope and think that just about every teacher of creative writing embraces and thinks, there is almost always that exception to that rule out there. So I like to say that these are generally things that are almost always true, though not necessarily are always true. You're going to see that these are also ways of thinking about teaching creative writing that I think run the gamut from your freshman/sophomore level, whatever it might be, introduction to creative writing course, all the way up to many graduate level courses. When I think about my own teaching, and I have done both of those ends, my job prior to being here at Lindenwood was at a community college where I taught introductory creative writing. I taught sort of what I will call introductory genres courses. So introduction to writing, fiction writing, introduction to nonfiction writing, et cetera, et cetera. But there, and here obviously I teach our graduate program exclusively. And so, but these are things that are principles that I think are applicable across that spectrum. So it doesn't really matter what you're teaching or what you want to teach; these can apply. And if you haven't noticed already in our course, you are going to really have the freedom to situate your projects and your assignments within the things that you are hopeful to and most interested in eventually teaching. So you can certainly be thinking through the lens of an introductory creative writing course. If you are a poet and you really want to teach poetry courses, your materials can all be related specifically to poetry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And also these, just like the teaching philosophy, I think these general philosophies on teaching creative writing are really helpful to focalize teaching, to drive the assignments that we create, and also, like I said earlier, that architecture of the courses as we make and are structuring them. Okay, so let's jump into a couple of these things. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is exploration. And that is that I think in general that great creative writing courses place a great deal of emphasis on the notions of exploration and discovery, of trying things out, of turning over the stones, to be a little cliched, and to find what's underneath. And so rather than being all about what is the final product, it is a greater focus on the process, whatever it is that you're teaching. So just to give you all an example, one of the courses that I teach here that I really love is a course called Writing Interconnected Stories. And so my goal in that class is, yes, people leave that course with drafts of a couple of stories that are somehow linked to each other. And they also leave with kind of brainstorms for the rest of a collection of linked stories. But the goal is not that those stories are perfect by the end of that 8-week term. Especially in our program, perfection is slow to come to. And so 8 weeks is a quick ask. But even in a more traditional 16-week semester or even year-long courses, which do exist, though they're even rarer than the way ours looks, I think that what is more important than whether students end up with, these perfect stories is that they come to a greater understanding of what an interconnected story collection is, that they've gotten a chance to explore and try out some ideas, see what they think might long-term work, see what maybe won't long-term work. And so that exploration is far more important than the final product itself. But also, when we talk about exploration, we're talking not just about encouraging students to do the actual writing and the thinking about their writing, but also to think about how they think about writing, using forms of reflection. Um, Probably many of you have had to write some kind of reflective piece at some point. In order to get into this program, you had to write a statement of purpose, which is a version of this, right? You're thinking about why you want to be in an MFA program, why you want to write. But getting students to really think about the why of what they're doing, the how of what they're doing, I think is totally a part of that exploration, but also making it kind of low stakes. We're going to come back to evaluation here in a second. So those are some of the things that I think when we talk about writing courses as exploration is really fundamentally important. Then, of course, we come to reading. And I don't think I'm saying anything particularly controversial when I say that writers must read. I have never in my writing life encountered a writer whom I respect or whom I would identify as successful using any number of different metrics, who is not also a pretty dedicated reader. And so, one thing that I think is important is to get students to engage with model texts in their classes. This might be the one course that I've ever taught where we are not reading model creative work. And that feels very strange to me. Now, I will say, though, if you've looked ahead in our class, you're going to, as we talk about designing a course syllabus, you are going to read some sample syllabi. So you could think of those as model texts of a sort. And so um, you can see that if I kind of twist the definition of model text, um, it's still here in a class like this. And so thinking about long term, one of the things you want to think about is how do you want reading to show up in your creative writing classes? I have never taught a creative writing course in my entire academic career that did not have students reading model texts. Um, Sometimes they've accused me of having them read too much, but I don't listen to them. That's a partial joke. Maybe. But then the thing that I think is also important is to, as a teacher, encourage reading and encourage students and encouraging yourself, um, by creating reading lists. So I encourage students to go out and find other texts to read. So I always have additional reading lists in my classes. When I'm able to, I give students very specific recommendations. Oh, your story reminds me of this. Not that you're copycatting it, but you might get some good insights on what you can do with your story by reading this or reading this collection. In that writing interconnected stories course, they read two interconnected collections, but I have a whole list of other things that they might also want to read. So thinking about how you can ground your teaching of writing within strong use of reading. And then just some other things that I think of as staples that you will find in just about every writing course in some amount. There's no perfect number of any of these things in a particular class. But I think these are the things that kind of make up a staple writing course. And first of all, there's low stakes exercises. So having students do writing that you simply give them credit for, that you're not evaluating, even drafts of things. If you're going to have somebody workshop things, we'll come back to again. I promise we'll come back to evaluation here in a moment. But having these things that are low stakes, that there's less pressure to perform well, and there's more pressure to simply perform in some way. Obviously, readings and discussion. Again, that notion of model texts being the grounding foundation of what you do in a class, and being the things that lead you in instruction. But then also what I call interactive lectures. So the tricky thing in an online class is that it's not always easy to interact, right? But when I used to teach in person, I would have things I wanted to talk about on a given day, but it wasn't just me talking for 25 minutes. It's me bringing up things, asking people questions, getting their insights as well. So avoiding doing what I'm basically doing here, which is making you sit there and passively listen to my video and hopefully not having another window open and doing something more exciting while I'm doing it. But finding ways to have those quote unquote lectures that are as interactive as you possibly can. And then there's also the things that you have all probably experienced in our course, having some kind of workshops. Now we'll see some example syllabi later in the term where, depending on the level of the class, that can be hard to do. But having an opportunity for students to receive feedback, and we are going to talk about workshops at length because there's lots of different ways to run those. But doing some kind of follow up with students after they receive all of that feedback, so that you can give them ways of thinking through what they want to do with it. And then, of course, as I said, some kind of either a revision assignment or that reflection that we talked about, like what do I want to do with this now that I've done it, right? Just sort of planning steps so that you can kind of, I think it's really valuable to send students off with a plan, even if they don't enact that plan within the confines of your course. Okay, so then the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is just some fundamental things about evaluation. And again, all of this stuff that I've already said, we're going to dive into more deeply. This is all the sort of stuff that you will get to think about how you want to personalize for yourself. We're going to expand on a lot of these things. This is trying to be quote unquote short and highlights. So evaluation. Evaluation, I think, is often about effort and completion rather than correctness. What do I mean by that? I joke with folks, but like, what is a B plus short story, or what does a poem look like to deserve a C minus? I don't know. And so I sidestep that problem by saying, look, you turned in a draft that's the length or thereabout that I asked for, or is the kind of poem that I asked us to write. So you get your points for that. And then similarly, as a result, the emphasis on grading things is more about engagement as opposed to perfection. So when I have students do a revision exercise, I don't grade that on did the draft get objectively better? Because one, what does that mean? But also what I look for, I don't know what that means, but also sometimes the steps of revision are you try something and it's not what you thought it would be. But you shouldn't be penalized for trying something to discover that it's not the route to go, right? And so as a result, I put that emphasis on the effort and engage. And that's what I'm calling engagement here, kind of, is effort rather than perfection. Um, and so those are really the staples of thinking about evaluation, thinking about how do you use your evaluation tools to reward the time and energy and thoughtfulness that people put into their work, as opposed to have they written a pushcart prize worthy short story. Is their novel opening chapter something that would get high profile agents reading? Obviously, you want those to be the things that happen, but is that the point and not how you're going to evaluate things? But as with this and everything else that I've already talked about and that we will talk about over the course of the term, the ultimate goal is that you make your courses your own. And so the question that you're going to want to think about, and think about this maybe as you go into writing this philosophy statement draft, and this is the one little bit of instruction that I'll give you about this, is that what you are trying to do is answer the question, what do you want students to experience? What do you want them to know? And what do you want them to become by virtue of taking your course? So you can, even if you want, if you've made it all the way through this video, use that as the prompting question that I'm asking you to answer in writing this philosophy statement. Is what do you want your students to experience, to know, and to become through taking your course? Okay? So those are my initial thoughts on this question of these philosophies. We will obviously dig into some of this some more as we go forward. But now I send you off to write your philosophy and then to continue on with the next set of our materials.